Good morning and welcome to Shattering Myths, a program that's devoted to those of you like me who know that there's something dreadfully wrong with the political, religious, military, media, and economic institutions which control our world. We realize that they are the problem and not the solution. Therefore, our mission here on Shattering Myths is to look behind the headlines, to know who is perpetrating the many tragedies that are besieging our planet. Because based upon this plague of adverse influences, we have at most 15 years before the world collapses and it no longer exists as we currently know it. So as a result, in our second hour, we're going to engage God on his terms through evidence and reason, since his guidance regarding his covenant provides the only reliable escape. Our phone number for those who would like to participate in this discussion is 877-300-7645. Amazing revelation in the news this morning. 5 billion people around the world are being followed by their cell phones. First of all, it is astonishing that 5 billion people have cell phones. I can't imagine that number can be accurate. I mean, there's only 7 billion people on the planet today. And when you recognize that of the 7 billion people, at least a quarter of them would be too young, and at least, wouldn't say a quarter, maybe 10% would be too old, and a significant number live in places where there just are no significant numbers of cell phone towers, and so many people live in abject poverty. So many people live in where half the population, women in particular, in the Islamic world, are illiterate and making cell phone use at least a bit more challenging, particularly in the smartphone realm. It just doesn't seem remotely possible to me that 5 billion people are being tracked by way of their cell phone use, because I don't think there's 5 billion cell phones out there. But regardless of that, it is certainly interesting that a new technology has become so ubiquitous, and that the world is so remarkably connected. Even if the number is half of what the report says, it puts us in a time where all of the scriptural prophecies in terms of global events are feasible. The other thing that, of course, is horrendous about this is you've just got to recognize how utterly out of control the U.S. government is. This is a really extraordinary set of circumstances, because it is death by a million cuts. Snowden and the Guardian, the newspaper in the UK that was given the whole of Snowden's cache of documents, have only released 1% of what he can offer. Only 1%. And the United States is just wholly behind the curve here. The United States has been exposed as a nation not sponsoring freedom, but trying to constrain freedom. Not a nation of laws, but a nation that is lawless. It has been exposed not as a nation you can trust, but as one that isn't trustworthy. And each new revelation cuts deeper into the credibility and the character of the nation's soul. It's the way that America responded to this was denial, and then let's not deal with the message. Let's try to character assassinate the messenger. Has put it in a situation where it is going to receive another lash every week, another cut, until there's absolutely no credibility left. I mean, the answer is fairly simple. What the U.S. government should have done once the revelations were out that it had a secret court and no longer was dealing with due process, that it was spying on Americans and depriving them of their constitutional rights, was spying on people around the world, including allies and world leaders, that it was monitoring every click of a internet user, and every phone call of anyone with a cell phone. That the moment that was out and that personal privacy no longer mattered and that the U.S. government was completely out of control, the only rational choice at that moment was to shut down the NSA, to say, it's a rogue organization, it got way out of hand, and we're going to fire all of those with knowledge of this, and we're going to shut the NSA down. Just shut it down. It doesn't do us one bit of good. It's obvious who wishes the United States harm. It isn't the Russians. It isn't the Chinese. It isn't the North Koreans. It's Muslims. Oh, of course, there are others besides Muslims, but with Muslims, we don't have to listen to their chatter. No, just read their playbook. Read the Quran, read the Hadith. You'll know why they want to destroy everyone who isn't a Muslim and to kill every Muslim who doesn't agree with them on every issue. You don't need an intelligence community. You don't even have to buy Prophet of Doom. It's available free online. There's nothing the U.S. government can gain via NSA related to Islamic terrorism, and Islamic terrorism is 99.9% terrorism. Shut it down. The same thing, of course, is true with the U.S. military. Once it was determined that the U.S. military is the most damning place in the world for women, that a woman is more vulnerable to being sexually abused in the U.S. military than any place else, that character flaw ought to have been enough to shut it down. You can't allow people who have that little regard for women, who are openly abusive of women, and an officer corps that protects the abusers and continues to abuse the victims. You can't allow them to play with weapons of mass destruction. They don't have the judgment. They don't have the morality. And when it was determined that virtually every war that America has fought has not been to protect American liberty, and virtually every war that America has engaged in has been based initially on an outright lie, we ought to have paid attention to what Jefferson had to say and shut that down as well. We'd be enormously more safe if we were to do so. That is, at this point, the only rational option available to us. Shut them down before they do all of us irreparable harm. I want to return to the situation at Syria before we move to the Ukraine. Yesterday I began a story where we read that the interview between two opposing sides. One was the leader of the defense forces trying to protect Damascus, and the other was the rebel leader who was trying to capture Damascus. The rebel leader made a quote. He said, "We have gone back to the Stone Age." Well, the only difference in Syria between what it was 3 years ago and what it is now is the advent of the jihadists sponsored from around the world, provided with weapons from Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Qatar, and the United States, and they are besieging the government of Syria. And so if Syria has gone back to the Stone Age, and if you look at pictures of Syria, it is ghastly. It looks far worse than what Syria would have looked like, or what any community you would expect to look like many, many thousands of years ago. It's a hell zone, what they have wrought. And so the reason that it is there, has gone to this state, and that people are being abused this way, and that they've destroyed what they've had, is because of the influence of Islam. Rebels say that the Assad regime is trying to starve civilians that are stuck in the contested areas. Well, the only reason that they're stuck in the contested areas is because they're being contested. You know, you can't expect a government to not try to defend itself when foreigners armed to the teeth with advanced weapons are trying to destroy it. It's going to fight back. And the government is saying that, you know, we're happy to provide everybody with access to food. But if we provide food and medicines in these contested areas, then those who are providing, driving the vehicles are captured or killed by the rebels, and then the food is used as a weapon by the rebels, saying, you get to eat if you agree to fight for us. Otherwise you don't. There's no way to win here. And to blame one side or the other is just stupid. As for the commander that is fighting on behalf of the regime in Damascus, when the reporters asked him what Syria's military was fighting for, Abu Salem said it's a lot more than trying to preserve Assad's rule. He says that is not the primary goal. Now, that's something that Americans don't want to hear, particularly those loyal to Barack Hussein Obama, but this is the man's quote. He is the leader of the defense of Damascus. He said, "This is a battle for a secular state against Islamic ideals. We want to preserve Syria as a diverse society," end quote. Yeah, put that in your pipe and smoke it, John McClown, senator from Arizona. Rather than the rebels being freedom fighters, they're Islamic fundamentalists, they're jihadists, they're murderers. And rather than the military in Syria being draconian, being the enemy, they are the ones who want to maintain what America claims it stands for, a secular society where people of diverse cultures and religions can live in harmony and in peace. It is the opposite of what America is trying to portray in Syria. And it's what we've been saying for a long time, that while Assad is rotten to the core, a horrible individual, the fact is that his regime is secular. Christians are allowed to live. With the jihadists, they will all die. Sunni Muslims were allowed to live. Under the jihadist regime, Shia Muslims will all die. Welcome back to Shattering Myths. I had a moment to look up an article on the story that was presented by SRN this morning. It doesn't speak of the world having 5 billion cell phone users, because that number would be ludicrous. There's no chance that 5 of the 7 billion inhabitants of our world today have cell phones. The number is 5 billion, but it's reference to 5 billion data points that are being collected each day is really the what is being gathered. In fact, specifically, the National Security Agency gathers nearly 5 billion records a day on the location of mobile telephones worldwide. Of course, they're tracking cell phones of Americans and non-Americans alike. It's a complete indiscriminate search. It's interesting that telling, I should say, that the story that is provided by Reuters on this begins with a large picture. And the picture is of some very expensive and elaborate listening devices, geodesic domes, that are on the outskirts of Berlin in Germany. The mountain that they sit atop is called the Devil's Mountain. Yes, it's some of this stuff is just, too funny for words. Now turning to the Ukraine. It's pretty hard to miss that there's a significant uprising in the Ukraine. Initially, I just passed over it because I had not thought that what is occurring inside of Russia was going to have a major influence on our world. I look at Russia's relationships with countries, particularly with Iran and therefore Syria, as having influence, and the connections and the allegiances that are being made on behalf of China and Iran and Russia and Iran and their allies relative to the oil and gas reserves in the Caspian Sea area, and how that is shaping world politics. But internal affairs within Russia and amongst the nations that became independent upon the breakup of the USSR had not been an area of concern. But what's taking place in Ukraine turned out to be interesting for two reasons. The first is the politics here have the people of Ukraine, some 350,000 of them each day, are now marching in protest against their quote-unquote elected government. Now, the elected government has been elected on what was considered to be one of the most massive fraud campaigns in modern history. And back about a dozen years ago, the citizens of Ukraine formed what was called the Orange Revolution to protest against the sleaze and electoral fraud that had occurred. And it might have been closer to 9 or 10 years ago, but about in that time frame. Well, the guy and the party that was elected using sleaze and fraud is still there. So the protests were lodged, but what happened appears to be that Putin's cronies wanted the Ukraine to be back under the control of Russia, because Russia with the Ukraine is a much more dominant world influence than Russia without the Ukraine. And so the principal means to accomplish this had been to recognize the Ukraine is dependent upon oil and gas, and the only place they can get oil and gas is from Russia, so it goes right back to the Caspian Sea and other Russian reserves of oil. And the Russians made the Ukraine dependent upon Russia by controlling its access to oil. Now, the Ukrainians want to be part of the European community. They want to be part of the euro. And so what they're trying to do is to establish treaties, and they had negotiated a treaty with the European Union, which would have included the Ukraine in the European Union, as opposed to being under the control of Russia. But these politicians, this was the second front that Putin initiated, is that slate of politicians that were the electoral fraud and sleaze gang, well, all of them are influenced by Moscow. And so they recently reneged on the European treaty per Moscow's request, making Ukraine still dependent on Russia and therefore easily controlled by Russia. And that's what the 350,000 people are protesting against each day. Welcome back to Shattering Myths. Good information is always hard to come by, and it's always interesting the more you research something, the more you learn. Returning to cell phones, and we'll return to the Ukraine here in just a moment. According to the industry, there are actually not 5, but 6 billion cell phones in active use throughout the world today. And that by the end of 2014, there's expected to be 7.3 billion cell phones, with the world population being about 7 billion people. Now, there are countries like in Russia where there are 1.8 cell phones per person, per capita. And that's for the entire population, including, infants, up to 5-6 years old, children, and the affirm. And that's the entire population, and there's 1.8 times the number of cell phones in use than there are people. So the real question is, how many people have a cell phone and a cell phone subscription? That number is much harder to come by. But in China, for example, there are 1 billion cell phone users according to the industry. In India, there's about 900 million cell phone users according to the industry. Fascinating numbers. It would be, of course, interesting to know how many of those cell phone accounts are people with multiple cell phones, and even why someone would have multiple cell phones, unless the issue really is a matter of business versus personal use or that sort of thing. Returning to the Ukraine, the reason that this story is important is twofold. One is that the means to which the people are being controlled is something that we're going to see play out time and again around the world. And the second is going to be based upon a comment that Putin made, which we'll get to in a moment. The control mechanisms that will be used to influence people will be election fraud. There's lots of ways to control an election. The principal ways of doing it in Russia happen to be that when Putin gained more and more power, he took Russia to a fascist condition whereby the media is all state-controlled. So he controls what the people read and see and the like, at least to the degree that he controls television, radio, and newspapers. He can't, of course, control the internet, but he can block access to sites and prosecute people who are willing to reveal the truth. In other ways, however, since the government apparatus is the one reporting the votes, they can simply report anything that they want. And other ways that they go about doing it, and we'll do it around the world, is that if you are a viable threat to the establishment, to the insiders, they will have trumped-up charges brought against you. You'll be mercilessly tarred and feathered in the media, and you'll end up being in prison because they control the judiciary. They control the police. That's the nature of a police state. To rise up in opposition and to expose and condemn those who are empowered becomes extraordinarily costly. The other ways to do it, of course, are economically, and the primary economic tool is oil. It's what made the United States a debtor nation, amongst other things, but it's one of the first things that contributed to our debtor status, the importation of oil. And in Russia, they control the pipelines and access, and so the Ukraine, just as is Europe, is dependent upon Russian oil. And just like America is dependent to a large degree on Saudi oil. And so the Ukrainians are saying, economics is the freedom, it's the mechanism that will create opportunity and freedom for our people, a life worth living. And so they've attempted to break the bonds of economic control that is the nature of a fascist condition, and tried to unify with the European Union, but Russia sees that as a threat, so they have forestalled that. And that is why the people are revolting. But what are they getting for it? They are in an environment where the government has all of the guns and the people have none. So what can they do? Almost nothing. And it's the kind of thing that we're going to witness here in the United States. You're going to see it around the world as economic conditions deteriorate, and they have completely fallen apart in the Ukraine. As a matter of fact, in the Ukraine, there is the possibility that the savings accounts of Ukrainians will soon be tapped, as they were in Cyprus, to keep the banks afloat. It is that desperate a situation that it is likely that martial law will be imposed. As a matter of fact, the president of the Ukraine, who is a Moscow loyalist, Yanukovych, in his first comment said, a bad peace is better than a good war. Telling these people, stand down, you can't make war with us, and just accept what you got. Everyone must observe the laws of our state. It was his next statement. And it is the laws of the state that become overwhelmingly onerous, that enable state institutions, countries, to control their people. Now, he is, by the way, off now in China trying to get China to loan them money to keep their country afloat. His decisions to abandon the trade pact with the European Union makes the Ukraine wholly dependent on Russia and therefore totally controlled by Russia. And so here what you're seeing is something we've talked about in the past, how capitalism is both manifest in fascism and in communism. That all the difference between communism and fascism is control versus ownership. And if you have total control, ownership becomes irrelevant. And so what Russia is attempting to do is to have total economic control over the Ukraine, which puts it in an identical situation to the communist system where they had complete ownership of the Ukraine. Total control versus total ownership, there's no difference between those concepts. And that is exactly what is occurring. And it's what's going to occur around the world. The central bank in the Ukraine was forced to intervene to prop up the currency and threatened more action, underlying Kiev's vulnerability as it seeks more than $17 billion next year. And guess what it's soliciting the $17 billion for? To meet gas bills and for debt repayments. It is being controlled by its previous debts and by access to gas, fuel. Russian President Vladimir Putin blamed outside actors for the protests, which he said amounted to an attempt to unsettle the Ukraine's legitimate rulers. Now, before I share with you his quote, think about that for a moment. The outside actor that is influencing Ukraine is Vladimir Putin himself. What he's saying is absolutely true. It's just that he himself is the perpetrator. And he knows that the Ukraine's rulers aren't legitimate and they ought not be termed rulers. To even call them rulers suggests that they are despots, that they're dictators. We don't call Obama the ruler of the United States. No, he's president of the United States. Here Putin spoke of legitimate rulers. That gets back to the fascist and communist mentality again. This is his quote. "This reminds me more of a pogrom than a revolution." End quote. Putin told reporters on a visit to Armenia. "This reminds me more of a pogrom than a revolution," Putin told reporters. So what in the world is a pogrom? Now, yesterday I jokingly said, okay, a pogrom might be you forgot misplaced the R, and it's really a kind of a program, and this would be a redneck version of the swamp guy on the Discovery Channel. It says, I want you to watch my pogrom. Well, pogrom is a Russian word. It means to wreak havoc and to demolish violently. Historically, since he says this reminds me of, then he's referring to an event in history. Historically, the term pogrom refers to violent attacks by non-Jews against Jewish populations. Here's what Wikipedia would have to say about it. A pogrom is a violent massacre or persecution of an ethnic or religious group, particularly one aimed at Jews. The term originally entered the English language to describe the 19th and 20th century attacks on Jews in the Russian Empire, mostly within the Pale of Settlement in present-day Ukraine. Now, this is really interesting. It is in the Ukraine, more than any other place, that Jews were systematically hunted down and murdered, terrorized. You know, there's this prophecy that Yahowah issued relative to his people and to his covenant, saying that he would bless those who bless Israel and curse those who curse Israel. Well, similar attacks against Jews at other times and places also became retrospectively known as pogroms. Well, a pogrom, the first of them occurred in the Ukraine, and the most vicious of them occurred in Ukraine. The word is now also sometimes used to describe other punitive attacks, but it's almost always attacks directed at the Jewish ethnic or religious groups. Now, why did Putin refer to these as pogroms? The people aren't in a witch hunt against Jews here, but think of the attitude that was on display back then. Welcome back to Shattering Myths. We're considering the influence of the pogroms and why Vladimir Putin referred to them, the revolutionary protests that are taking place with hundreds of thousands of people in the Ukraine, and why the Ukraine is in such a deplorable state at the moment. Ukraine is considered to be amongst the most impoverished non-Muslim countries in the world. The first thing that we learn is that the first of these pogroms, or violent attacks against Jews, occurred in Odessa. The first of them is chronicled in 1859. Now, for those who do not know, Odessa is the third largest city in the Ukraine. It happens to be on the shores of the Black Sea. We were talking about, the influence of the communities in eastern Turkey and around the Black Sea during our program programs on Noah. Well, Odessa is the third largest city of the Ukraine. It is on the Black Sea. And in 1859, there were Greek sailors and had not only moved into the town, but also were aboard ships in the harbor. These Greek sailors and local Greeks who lived in Odessa began a program of horrors, as it is described in Wikipedia, against Jews. The first pogrom occurred on all days on Easter Sunday, with the local press, which, according to the Greeks, were sympathetic to the Jews, inflaming the fight. Although the pogrom of 1871 was occasioned in part by the rumor that Jews had vandalized the Greek community's church, many non-Greeks participated in it. In other words, a number of Ukrainian Russians decided to participate in it. And of course, it was perpetrated by a lie, that the Jews had desecrated a Greek Orthodox church. It's just like all of the conspiratorial lies today that are promoted by conspiracy theorists against Jews. So a lie was used to instigate hatred towards the Jews, and Russian resentment and hostility, this report says, toward the Jews came to the fore in the pogrom of 1871 as Russians joined Greeks in attacks on Jews. In an 1871 period, it says that the pogroms were often perpetrated with the tacit approval of the Tsarist authorities. Now, the czars were taken down, and we now learned that the czars not only provided tacit approval, but czarist troops were used to aid and abet these terrorist attacks on the Jewish community. Evidence indicates and exists that during the 1905 pogrom, the army actually supported these mob attacks upon Jews. Let me read now from Wikipedia's account of it. The Bolshevik party, who was in Odessa at the time, recalls what happened. Quote, There I saw the following scene. A gang of young men between 25 and 20 years old, in today's parlance we would say between 20 and 25 years old. It's not the number of young men in the gang. They were far more numerous than that. That's the average age of the belligerents. Among whom there were plainclothes policemen and a significant numbers of Okonra, which are officials in the Bolshevik regime, were rounding up anyone who looked like a Jew, men, women, and children. They were stripping all those who looked like Jews naked, and then they beat them mercilessly. We immediately organized a group of revolutionaries armed with revolvers. We ran up to them and we fired at them. They all ran away. But suddenly between us and the pogromists, there appeared a solid wall of soldiers, armed to the teeth, facing us. We retreated. The soldiers went away, and the pogromists came out again. This happened a few times. It became clear to us that the pogromists were acting together with the Bolshevik military. End quote. Stunning, is it not? In 1905, the pogrom of Odessa was the worst anti-Jewish pogrom in history. Between October 18th and 22, ethnic Russians, Ukrainians, and Greeks killed over 400 Jews. We'll return in a moment.